welcome to Aging Together today. Our guest today is Dr. Kim Harms, an end-of-life expert. Dr. Harms helps people understand the importance of showing their love for their families by setting them up for success through comprehensive legacy planning. Dr. Harms has witnessed death up close many times throughout her life. She suffered the loss of her mother and her son to suicide, and eventually her husband from a broken heart. These events shaped her views on finding meaning in grief, and she set out on a mission to end the stigma around end-of-life planning. As a fourth quarter coach and international speaker specializing in grief, conflict resolution, and legacy planning, she helps people put an emotional life insurance plan in place so that their loved ones are left in an emotionally healthy space after they are gone. Her book, Are You Ready? How to Build a Legacy to Die For, discusses how to build a legacy that lives on after your death. It was a #1 bestseller on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and named the most inspirational book of 2024 by the Pacific Book Awards. Dr. Harms, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me here.
I think a lot has changed, or I believe you've been working on some new stuff since we last talked, so I'd love for you to introduce that.
Yes, well, I have a dear friend, Kathy Dempsey, who is also a death doula, and we really felt the need to lighten up the discussion about death and make it so that we can talk about it openly, talk about basically living all the way to the end. And we have a new podcast called Rethinking Death.Life, which focuses on dying well by living well today and being prepared.
That's wonderful and such a needed resource. Something that comes up in conversation quite frequently is that there's two main things people don't talk about that needs to be talked about: money and death, right? Two really important topics that leaves families devastated. And we don't talk about it. So
I was just going to say, when you combine money with death, which is poor planning, where they don't know what to do with the money, it's confusion and chaos.
Yeah.
So those are two important things.
Absolutely. So let's start with, can you share your personal story and what inspired you to even write your book that you wrote, the Are You Ready? How to Build a Legacy to Die For?
Well, my personal story basically is I have suffered through a lot of deaths. My mother to suicide, my son to suicide, my husband to a broken heart, and cousins and other dear friends along the way. And when my husband died, my husband and I were dentists, and we practiced together for many years. And when he died, I found myself alone in that crazy place between menopause and death. I'm 68 years old, and I'm looking, okay, one side's menopause, the other side's death. What the heck do I do now? And I realized that I was now alone. I had to make all these decisions, figure out my life purpose alone with nobody to help me. It was a terrible spot. But then I started to think, I'm still here. And if I'm still here, I still have purpose. And I started searching for what that purpose was. And I realized that all of the experiences I've had in my past can be helpful to teach people how to build resilience in the future. And so that really was the impetus for, I've written 2 books for widows, the faith-based books for widows. And then I wrote Are You Ready? How to Build a Legacy to Die For, which is a secular book for anyone learning how to build your legacy now that you can pass on to the next generation. And then part of that is learning about death. Part of the book talks about learning about death. And then the other part of the book, the last half, is everything you need to know before you go. All the stuff you got to do, a check-off list of the things you had to have in a one little binder, so your family can just, when you pass away, they're not going through your records and trying to find things, in that chaos that you may have left behind. Everything is in one place. And that really helps them with the grief process. It helps them to avoid that confusion, chaos, and the conflict that many times occurs if you don't get things in order before you die.
Yeah, that is so important. I know part of the work I do is setting people up for success for some of those end-of-life decision-making needs, particularly related to hospice or critical decision-making during hospitals. But there is so much more to it than just the practical paperwork, right? You really have to think about what it means for a family to navigate that and what it means for that person as they're leaving the world behind, right? And we talk a lot about insurance, right? So we have medical insurance, we have life insurance, we have care insurance, but you talk about emotional insurance. What does that mean to you, and how does it differ from the financial and practical end of life planning?
I believe that we need to talk about our death, that there's going to come a time. It's practical planning for the future. Really, you can kind of change the wording around so that it's more palatable to everybody. You need to let people know what's going to happen. First of all, to let them understand, okay, I'm a grandma. I'm next. I want to go next because I had lost a son and I don't want that to happen again. I want to be next in line. And what life's going to be like after that, how I've prepared them, what I want to teach them, all the lessons that I've learned about resilience that I would like to pass down to them and build that emotional resilience. Also, I think it's important. I talk about when I was a grief counselor for a while back in the day, and one of the things I learned was we all know Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, but there's a man named Worden who developed the 4 tasks of mourning. And I like tasks because a task are like you can get through those things, right? And the first task is acceptance, which is where Kubler-Ross leaves off. The second part is processing the grief. And people need to realize grief takes time to process, and everybody's different. We all process it different. We all do it on different timelines. There's no set processing time, but you got to work through it. And I really would like to encourage people to fight through it. I don't think you have to work through it. It doesn't just happen if you just sit there. I mean, I think we could all, I would stay under the bed for the rest of my life if I stayed in that grief pit. The next part, after you processed it, is to understand your new environment. My new environment as someone who lost a child. How many children do I have? Those are tough questions. The new environment after I lost my husband. I'm a widow. I'm all alone. I was married for 44 years. I was 19. I've never lived alone in my life. What am I going to do now? You have to kind of come to terms with that. And then the final stage is where you take that person, that loved person, and you put them in a place in your heart or in your brain or wherever you put that person and honor them, but then live the rest of your life clear of the shroud of grief. Live the rest of your life open. And the wonderful thing about that is that our grief affects everybody around that. And I now have 6 grandchildren that I didn't have when my son died. And I feel that my responsibility, we all have different responsibilities in life, is first of all with my family. So I've kind of made a decision to move half the time to Kansas City with 3 and half the time in Minneapolis so I could be in part of the lives of those children, because that's my legacy. But find a place you can do that. I can do it freely. I can do it. I'm not in the shroud of grief. They benefit. I benefit. It's a joyful place to be. So I just like to remind all of your listeners to fight the grief pit. That's my biggest message. Fight it.
Yeah. Does this tasks of mourning offer some sort of timeline to it, or do people kind of go through it at different phases?
I wish that we could put a timeline on grief, but we can't. I will tell you something that really helped me tremendously. The single moment that made a huge difference, I think probably cut some years off of my grief time, was after my son died, and it was a suicide. You can imagine he was a brilliant, amazing college student at Columbia. Everything was going his way. He was just got the dean's list in engineering. He was elected to student government, and he could play jazz piano in the jazz program at Columbia. I mean, he was on top of the world. Everything was going his way. And then 2 weeks later, his girlfriend broke up with him, which is a normal part of life, right? And 45 minutes later, he was gone. 45 minutes, and we were completely broken. We were shattered. And a few months after Eric died, I was coming out of my dental office, and I was in that zombie phase. I mean, anyone that's been through grief knows you're a zombie on the inside, and you're trying to look normal on the outside. And, it's a really tough phase. I was coming out of my office, and my husband's cousin came up to me, wagging his finger in my face. And he said to me, "Don't you ever let your remaining children feel that they are not enough. Don't you do that to them." Because he had lost his brother at about the same age, and he felt that he lost his parents at the same time because they were so engulfed in grief, they couldn't focus on their living children, right? And I was there. I could have stayed there forever. And I realized at that time I had 2 living children. I had a husband who had just had a liver transplant, so he was struggling as well, physically and emotionally. And so I just determined that it caused me to like have a new way of thinking, that my grief affected everybody else. And I was determined to fight, kick, scream, claw my way out of that pit. I got some counseling. I suffer from depression. I got some treatment. And I was able, over years, it took years, but I was able to get out of that grief pit. And it's hard. And sometimes you sink back in. You get out of the grief pit and you think you're okay. And then something comes back and there you go. But it's such a joyful life to be out of that pit. And so I think we all can, I think it's a choice to fight. It might not be a choice how fast you get out, because we're all different, but there is a choice to fight or to allow it to consume you. And I would like to just encourage everyone to choose the fight. I can tell you it's worth it.
Yeah, I think you touched on 3 very important pieces there. The first is the impact of community support, right? You said your husband's brother or your cousin
Yes.
came in, right? And so that impact of community support. 2 is the access to professional support, right? Like you
Yes.
said, for your depression, for therapy. And then the third is that intentional choice to fight, and really showing up and intentionally choosing to show up every single day afterwards, which is honestly, I think, the hardest part for a lot
Very
of people. And, as someone who has helped or seen friends navigate grief, we could show up for them as much as we try to from that community aspect of it. But if they can't intentionally choose to show up, even the community level of support will start fading away, right? And it's a very convoluted mix of those 3, right? It's not a cut and dry approach. It's not like, yes, if we do X, Y, and Z, you're going to overcome grief. That's not a thing. But I think those are 3 really important pillars to stand by of, here's their access to support, and then also your intention to continue to show up in life. So along with your talk about emotional insurance, you also talk about the importance of leaving an emotional legacy. What does that mean? And what does that look like? And why is that important?
Well, in my book, I have 15 legacies that I listed, but emotional legacies are any positive impact you can have on the life of your children. And what I talk about is the legacies such as, first of all, love. Everybody can leave love. Everybody can leave love. Any country, any place, any faith, you can leave love. That's the most important thing. People need to know they're loved. Education is one. Faith might be one. Art. There's so many things. Hard work, learning to work hard. My husband came from a very hardworking family, and so he passed down the hardworking ethic to our children. Those are all legacies that you could leave. There's thousands of them, but you need to focus. I'm asking people to really focus on intentionally leaving that legacy. Resilience, of course, is very important for me since I lost a son and a mother to suicide. So, I'm really trying to pound resilience, into my grandkids as much as I can. So those are all positive legacies. And I think that the goal is to leave the next generation better prepared emotionally than we were, and also be prepared for our death. I know this works. I know this works because I talked to my little Heidi. I have one of my grandchildren is little redheaded Heidi, and she was at the table a few months ago, and she looked up at me and she said, "Nana," and I said, "Yeah, Heidi," and she said, "If what happens to Pop happens to you," and I said, "You mean if I die?" And she said, "Yes, if you die." And I said, "Okay, what if I die? What, Heidi?" And she said, "Well, if you die, can we still go to Disney World?" And I said, "Yes, because I want you to thrive." And that's a message we need to give to them. We're going to be gone, but we want you to thrive. In fact, both my daughters are attorneys. I called them up and said, "Okay, in my will, I want to put money aside for a trip that you guys can go to, depending on what time I die, if Disney World's appropriate or maybe someplace else, depending on how old I am and how old they are. I want to put money aside to celebrate and celebrate together as a family." And I want them just to know that that's what I want. I want them to be strong. And, again, with my situation with 2 suicides, that's ingrained in me. And it's like one of my battles now is just to help them do that.
Yeah, that's such an innocent question from a young kid. And I think, kudos to you for entertaining the question, right?
Mhm.
And then also turning it into something positive and talking about it, because I think that's part of the world of not talking about it, is that
Mhm.
you never talk about it. Growing up, it's never come across until your family or you have experienced it. And then all you see is the doom and gloom of it, right? And so we never get to fully experience that this is a definitive part of life,
Yes.
right? Everyone's going to die, at least as of right now.
So right
Right. And we have to talk about it. And that starts young so that kids can develop that knowledge and insight into, hey, death is inevitable. We can talk about it, but we can also make sure that the other side of it is positive, right? And that there's still life afterwards.
Mhm. And one of the things that I've done too to just help with that is uh, one way to show your love for your family is to get all your estate issues taken care of. I have everything in a binder, including like the titles to my car, any real estate thing, no matter everything they're going to need to just settle everything is in this binder. And I also put love letters to them. I tell each member of my family, my daughters, my son-in-laws, my children, how much I love them. And then I've also been writing little Valentines. The first Valentine was written to be delivered posthumously. St. Valentine wrote a letter to be delivered after his death. Look at the impact that one had. So, when my family goes and they're opening up this binder that I carefully put together for them, hopefully they'll remember she must love us because she put this all together so we wouldn't have to scrimmage through her home, right? But then, just to make sure they don't quite get how much I love them, they'll see the letters and they'll see the little Valentine stuck in there. So they will be reminded that I was expecting to die. This is part of life, but I want them to understand how much they were loved. And I think that again is trying to build up that emotional security surrounding death.
That's so wonderful. I think it's not even just a show of love, it's a show of thoughtfulness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of understanding the impact of death on a family, knowing that it's going to be very devastating, and
Yes.
how can we make sure that we set them up for success, right? I
Exactly.
remember all the aftermath of my grandparents passing away, right?
Mm-hmm.
The aftermath of all of that. And whether it's known or unknown, right? One of my grandpas was known. He had a 3-year battle with cancer, and we still didn't get things together. Well, I was just starting college. I didn't have any of the information I have today, right? Um, and so I think that's where it does become difficult again, because we're not rooted in understanding the aftermath of it. Now, I think you touched on a piece of this. One practical strategy is creating a literal binder, right? But when you
Mm-hmm.
talk about all of this, what are some practical steps that individuals can take to ensure that they're leaving behind more than just the financial assets? Because I think that's what a lot of people think about and
Mm-hmm.
take care of, is the financial piece of it.
Right.
But what are some practical strategies or steps that people can take for the emotional piece of it that you're talking about?
Well, one of the things that our family has it's a real treasure is my husband's mother, who grew up on the plains of Saskatchewan in carriages with potatoes in her pocket to keep her hands warm. We did a video with her before she passed away, so she could talk about her history and her legacy, and then the legacy of the family. So doing little legacy videos are so helpful, and you can do it on your phone. You could just look at your phone and do a video to send to your family. Writing legacy books, we have books for both my son and my husband that were written to honor their lives, pictures in there. My husband actually recorded times of his life, and my daughter then transcribed that and put it in a book with lots of pictures. Those are real treasures that you pass on. Sending out letters for important events, and for instance, a letter when they graduate from high school or graduate from college, or if they get married or have their first child, writing letters, just giving some wisdom about that issue. If you do that, though, you need to give it to someone you can kind of trust, and maybe a little younger, because you don't want to hand out a letter about having a child if they decide not to have children. You don't want to. So you got to be a little careful with that. But writing letters for special events, sending gifts, I'm going to be hopefully buying some. I haven't done this yet, but I plan on getting some gifts to put away, small gifts that to be handed out at the Christmas after my death. So all those little things you can do, just those tiny little things to just help remind them and help ease the burden. I also talk about, one of the letters that I send is about the task of mourning, and saying this is what you're going to go through. Just fight your way through it and get out as fast as you can. Those types of things. So practical advice that you can leave is very important. And I'm 68. I've learned a lot in 68 years that I hope that my family can learn before they're 68. I'm hoping I can pass on and make their journey through life, which is very difficult, a little bit easier by letting them know they're not alone. Many times we go through things, we feel like we're the only ones that have been through it. And if they know that you've been through it, you survived it, and give them tips on how to survive that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. This is giving me a lot to think about, because I think I work in the really practical space of this, right? So putting those plans together, making sure your finances and legal and all of that is put away. But lately I've been hearing more and more, and I'm meeting more people who focus on the legacy side of it. And I think it's something that doesn't get enough airtime for sure. But it's also something that I don't know has been as talked about before. And I think there's this new desire to leave behind legacies, because I think we're starting to actually realize how much we don't remember about our families or about our ancestors, especially in the immigrant space. So I'm a child of immigrants, and there's been a lot of work recently done in specifically the South Asian community to capture stories from our grandparents and our parents who survived the war in India and then immigrated here and started a life here, and trying to capture those stories now before people start dying. And I don't think that that's ever been something that was thought of before. But if you were to ask me what that was like, I have no idea. I was born here. I have no idea what my parents went through or what my grandparents went through. But it would be really cool to be able to learn that and pass that out, right? Living history book is what I think of.
Exactly. And doing the family history. There's some stories in my book about an Indian family, one of my dear friends whose father was orphaned and the mother was widowed in India. And he by resilience, worked and built his family up to a very prominent family. And how he did that, and then what he gave them, the education he was able to give his children. And I think that when you can look back and see the struggles, just like my mother-in-law who was in Saskatchewan with potatoes in her hand, when you can see those struggles that the immigrants that came here that paved the way for us to have a better life, it can really be a wonderful way to help your family understand and that maybe not take their life for granted so much. I think we learn a lot from people in other countries. I work in Rwanda quite a bit, and when it comes to forgiveness and reconciliation and a lot of other things in life, boy, they are light years ahead, of us here in the U.S. and taking those issues and those lessons and bringing them back to us and to our children can be very beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to switch gears a little bit into navigating difficult conversations. So we definitely talked about how we don't talk enough about this stuff. And I think a big part of that is it's a difficult conversation. End of life discussions are often uncomfortable for families. There might be some underlying family traumas. There might be some resentment. There might be difficult family dynamics, right? What advice do you have for starting those conversations?
Well, first of all, I want to just remind everyone, because it's easier not to do it. It's easier just to go and die, right? We go, we're gone and they'll take care of it. That's the easy thing to do. So I want to, first of all, remind everyone, it's hard, but it's an act of love. It's one of the biggest acts of love you can give to your family, because when you talk about death, and I like to freaking frame it in different ways, and everybody's different. I have one daughter that say, let's talk about it, Mom. Let's get this thing in order. We're going to get going. I have another daughter who's like, no, I don't want to really, Mom, I don't want to think about it. I want to think about it. You're fine, Mom. I don't want to think about it. So how do you do that? Well, I think reframing the issue, and instead of saying, let's talk about what happens when I die, you could just say, we really need to sit down and talk about the future and some of the plans I have for the future. Then it's, a future. Okay, we could talk about the future. And then perhaps do it at a time like Mother's Day is really, if you're a woman, hey, my Mother's Day gift. So you sit down with me. It's a little passive aggressive maybe, but it works. In a good sense. But for Mother's Day, could you sit down and let's just go over what I want to do with my will and maybe some changes and what I expect later on. But it's even more important. I have a very easy family. I have 2 daughters. They get along. They're both attorneys. It's 50-50, nothing exciting in my will. But sometimes you might have something that's a little unusual. For instance, I'm 68 now, but when I'm 70, and I don't know what life's going to look like for me. I'm watching my family getting, they're starting to maybe need some extra care or maybe full-time care, or dementia might set in. I don't know what's going to happen. And so it's important to do this while you're still thinking correctly. And if you've got something that's unusual, if there's say maybe there's someone in your family that needs full-time care, or maybe someone that might be disabled, it might need some extra money, you need to talk about that while you're alive to the family. Or for instance, if you feel that you're going to, if you become disabled or you need some help to get, at home, you need somebody to come and assist you instead of paying them. And I really recommend just paying them for the work they do beforehand. But then you have to pay taxes on it. I guess if you inherit the money, you don't have to pay taxes. If you pay them, you have to pay taxes. So you might think about that. But if you're going to give that person additional funding after you die because of the work that they did, it's important for you to tell your family and write it down in a letter of intent why you're doing this, and kind of with some sort of a system down that makes sense. Because they just need to, it does have to be equal, but if it feels like it's fairly done, there'll be less conflict later. And also, if it's in your words and your writing, there'll be less conflict later, because 50% of families have conflict around a death. Sometimes it's because, my husband, for instance, wanted to die at home. I had a nephew who was a physician who said, well, if you get him back in, they could drain his lungs, they could do that. But no, my husband wanted to die at home, and he filled out a healthcare directive, which everybody should have. So I just said, nope, healthcare directive, he wants to die at home. No problem. But if I had to make those decisions, and it would have been hard. He's obviously sick. I would think, let's get him to a hospital to get him better. But the hospital really wasn't going to get him better. It would just delay his death. And that would be my decision. It's a hard decision. And then other people might second guess that. So if you can put everything down and write everything down in your words as your decision, you will leave much less material to fight over after you die.
Yeah. I have a lot of stories. I've worked in the hospitals for almost a decade, and I have a lot of stories on family conflict when it comes to end-of-life decision-making, when there's no healthcare power of attorney assigned, when there's no living will, when there's no advance directive created. It creates so much turmoil in a family and inevitably delays death, which causes suffering, right? And then the aftermath of that is shame and guilt for the family. And so there's no positives out of not putting this stuff together at all, other than the sheer unwillingness to want to do it. Right. And so I love that you're putting the onus on each individual to have all their ducks in a row and put all their pen to paper. But how can family caregivers or loved ones help support that person when they're the ones who are resistant to talking about end-of-life plans? So, for example, I see a lot of clients who say, their parents don't want to talk about this stuff, but they need to figure it out because they're the ones who are responsible for it, for everything, right? And so what do you say on that?
I think one of the best things we can do is start educating people now, because I think I'm a baby boomer. My generation didn't want to talk about death, and many of my peers they want to just put it off. In fact, one of the sentiments was, I'm leaving them this money. So if I leave them this money, then they're just going to have to figure it out. Then I don't have to do it. Then it's, And I want to reframe that into, this is an act of love. This is something you need to do to show your love for us. Because if you don't do it, there's chaos and confusion and conflict can follow. So please, to help our family thrive after you're gone, do this for us. Do this for our family. It's very, very important for us to know what you want. Also, when it comes to end of life, like filling out the healthcare directive, we want to make sure we know what you want. And of course, what happens is we don't want to, many of us don't want to. Well, I don't want to think about that. If I think about it, it's going to happen, right? If I think about it, I write it down that it's going to make it happen faster. And there's a wonderful woman, Gail Rubin, who says, talking about pregnancy doesn't make you pregnant. Talking about death doesn't make you dead. And we just have to get that into our head. But I think positioning it as, Mom and Dad, we need you to do that for us. This is an act of love for us, because we want to make sure we want your wishes fulfilled. And hopefully we can change the narrative as the generations move up, as we educate each generation about the importance of this.
Yeah, I thank you for validating that. That's the exact approach I took with my family to get things sorted out, and they said, listen, I'm the one who's going to have to figure all of this out. So do it for me. Make my life easier after you're gone. Right. And that generally tends to go really well, because which parent doesn't want to set you up for success? Right. Exactly. In most cases. Right. So I think that's phenomenal advice. I want to, along with, I know you shared a lot of things about rituals and letters and keepsakes that you can leave behind for families to cope and feel connected, and including all of that as part of your plan. Along with some of that, you also talked about educating them and leaving behind practical advice that they can then use to help cope and move on. What are some of the common misconceptions or fears about end of life planning and end of life in general that you have heard come up or you've experienced come up? And how can those be addressed in similar forms of practical advice or letters or education?
Right. Well, the biggest thing I think that prevents people from getting their end of life affairs in order is just procrastination. They just, I know I need to do it, and but I'm going to do it later. And that's one of the biggest things. We just have to really commit them to understand that you could get hit by a truck, tomorrow. I had a sudden death in my family. I've had several, and you just don't know what's going to happen. So I think the fear of procrastination needs to be addressed. And then I think people are afraid of dying and afraid of talking about death. Again, it's going to make it happen faster. I had some dear friends whose mother was dying, and she had a lot of property, and she was fairly young, but she had a fatal disease. They knew she was her chances of living, were not good. Yet they didn't want to talk to her about changing the structure of those property ownership plans, because they were afraid that if they talked about death, they would feel they were betraying her, because if they're talking about their death, that she would know they think she's going to die, and that she wouldn't want to, it would hurt her feelings. And again, that's one reason we need to do it before we're sick. But certainly after, when we are sick, they spent years trying to get this all straightened out. It could have been done easily before she died. So I think that fear of talking to people about their death, about their own death, is a big thing. And I think the most important thing we need to remember, and also getting rid of stuff, one of the big barriers is that we know that when we die, someone's going to have to get rid of all of our stuff, right? And we're baby boomers, we kind of collect stuff. And so I think that one of the barriers is knowing that. And so I think that understanding that there are companies out there. I have money put aside for a company to come in. I told my girls, go through, take whatever you want, and here's a company that's going to come in and they're going to just liquidate everything else. So you don't have to worry about it. And I think sometimes just getting over those barriers that are going to happen when you die are very, very important. So overcoming the barriers, but most importantly, most of us, when you have children, you just love them so much. And if you can let that love lead you to getting this done, and perhaps doing it in groups. I kind of recommend, maybe I had my book club get together on the front of my book, there's people holding up their folders. It's my book club that got together and we took care of it together. So maybe getting support groups. I work with churches to get their legacy book together. So doing it as a group activity is also another help. But it's overcoming that procrastination and the fear of dying, and not understanding it's an act of love for your family and that you're leaving them in a bad situation if you don't do it. I think those things are all involved in the fear that people have when it comes to doing this.
Yeah, I think the root cause is what you were saying, though, about procrastination, right? Mm-hmm. And it's really important to understand why people procrastinate, right? The number one reason why people procrastinate is because they don't want to do it, right? There's an underlying reason why they don't want to do it. And whether that's anxiety, fear, poor education, poor awareness, those are the factors that can then be addressed to help prevent that procrastination, right? And so I think that's part of why we're talking about this is the more aware people are about why this is important, hopefully less people will procrastinate on this and start having these discussions. Right. Now, when we're looking at, putting all these pieces together, the financial aspect, the legal aspect, the emotional aspect, sometimes this stuff can become overwhelming for certain people. How can someone balance that emotional and practical aspect of end-of-life planning without becoming overwhelmed? And I know one of the options you said is to make it in a group activity, because then that can offer maybe some support and camaraderie around it. But do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, there are a lot of books. Mine include the last half of my book is a step-by-step guide to everything you need to know before you go, and check off list of all the things you need to do. And there are other books out there as well that are like that. So find a book or find a person that will help you do it, and do it as a checkoff list. I did it, and I did it probably. It took me only about a week. I had the will in place. It took me about a week to get everything together and organized to put in my book. It doesn't really take that long once you get started. And things like writing down your passwords. People don't realize that if you don't have your passwords written down, nobody can have access to your computer. And you might have a lot of important things in there, like, insurance policies and all kinds of things there that no one will get to. And unless you write it down and you put it in these binders or someplace where there's also some online versions that you can do. I recommend both. I recommended putting it in a binder and then having a folder on your computer and making sure everybody knows where that is. Those are really important. But I think that it really is that overcoming the procrastination and coming to terms. We have to come to terms with we're going to die. And I think most of us haven't come to terms with we're going to die. And we have to come to terms. It's like a graduation from life. So when you can come to terms with that, when you can understand that it's an act of love, and by not doing it, you're really hurting your family, I think all those things put together can help people to move forward with this.
Yeah, absolutely. We touched a little bit on cultural differences and how it could present differently across different family units. How do cultural attitudes towards death and dying impact our ability to prepare emotionally?
Yeah. I think that one of the things that I love recently, probably a few years back, the movie Coco came out. Did you see the movie Coco?
I haven't.
It's a story about a young boy in Mexico and his interaction with his dead relatives, and it's Day of the Dead, and that the Hispanic culture celebrates that, and they celebrate it as a family. And I think when you can talk about death and celebrate the life that was led by your ancestors, I think that is very, very helpful to your emotional management of death. So there are a number of cultures out there that embrace death and talk about death and prepare for death. Unfortunately, in the United States, I really believe that we kind of death is kind of optional. In fact, there's a guy that's right now that claims he's not going to die, and he's doing everything he can, and he's spending millions of dollars with machines and supplements and so on, and he's not going to die. We'll see how that works out for him. But we tend to feel we do everything we can to have every additional minute, which is good because then there's more legacy we can leave, right? We can lead healthier lives, but we don't admit that there's going to come an end in many cases. And in our hospitals, our physicians, for instance, my nephew who's a physician who was saying when my husband was sick, no, get him to the hospital, get him, drain his lungs, do this, do that. And my husband's like, no, I don't want to be I don't want to be intubated. I don't want to have this die when I'm going to go. That even within our medical profession, doctors are trained to do everything they can to maintain life, and death is seen as a failure in many cases. So we have to restructure that. And that's where the hospice movement, I love the hospice movement. And my husband was on hospice, and it was fabulous because we made him very comfortable. He had a very simple death. I mean, he was comfortable. It was very beautiful. And we had the family, we had like a living funeral the day before where the family all got together and he got to say goodbye to everybody. It was a beautiful death. And I think we need to be able to talk about that within the medical community and also among the rest of us. That it's 100% of us are going to die unless that one guy's right. Then we'll see how that works out. But so far, it's been 100%. So we need to just explain and educate our community. And there's no education about death, at least that I'm aware of within our school. Very, very little. There's some about coping, but very little information about the number one thing we're all going to experience together after birth is death. But we don't talk about it. So I think talking about it, how to manage it, how to get through grief, and the fact that we are going to die, and we just need to prepare for it like a graduation.
Yeah, I'm also a huge fan of hospice. My grandpa also, with his 3-year battle of cancer, ended with hospice. And we did something similar. He knew it was his time to go. And the day before, he asked for the whole family to get together. And that night he was gone. And it was really, it is beautiful. And then, we've experienced it again and again with a few other, even with a young friend of ours who passed away from brain cancer. And just the dignity that it allows somebody to die in peace, right? Versus the continuous gamut of healthcare in and out of that, if that's not what they really want. It's funny that you said we don't have classes on this stuff or education on this stuff. And going back, so my university offered an elective called Death and Dying, and a lot of my friends took it, and I unfortunately didn't. And now I always think back on it and wish I had, because I think it would have given me a lot more insights into stuff, especially with the work that I do now. I think it could have maybe helped me back then. But I was just talking to someone yesterday about how, at the beginning of life, we have so many resources and classes. There's parenting classes, there's prenatal books, there's prenatal education. There's all these, doulas and midwives and all of these things. But then when it comes to end of life, it's really just up to a single person or just the family, and there's not a whole lot of support. And I think that's changing. I do see an improvement and an influx of death doulas and end of life providers and hospice and palliative care and, all of those support services now, which I think is really important because we are going to have the largest prevalence or increase in rates of death, right, as the population becomes older. And so I love that you pointed that out, because it definitely is something that is hopefully changing for the better.
Yes.
Now, you also mentioned that you wrote 2 faith-based books for widows and widowers, right? What role do you feel spirituality and personal belief systems play in building upon that emotional insurance and emotional legacy?
Well, it's amazing how a faith binds people together. A faith in like how the world works is really what it's about, right? And what happens when we die. And most faiths believe that there's, when we die, we go to a good place. Most people believe we move forward into a good place. And that really does help. I believe very strongly that I'll see my mother and my son and my husband again. And I think that when you have a faith, when you have a belief that there's something out there that's more than just us, that there's something beyond our earthly existence, it really does help us to find purpose and meaning in life. What I've been doing, my purpose now is helping widows. I run some widows support groups and help widows find their purpose. They struggle. Widows find themselves alone, so we struggle with loneliness. We struggle with sense of purpose. We struggle with our identity. We used to be double. I was 44 years. I was part of a we, and now I'm a me. We had to work with that. We struggle with aging issues as our bodies start to decline, lack of independence, and all of those things. If we feel that there's a larger purpose for that, if we have a larger purpose in life, and mine is to help widows and raise my grandchildren, right? Build resilience in my grandchildren and help widows. That's my purpose right now. It can bring us great joy, and that's what I find through my faith-based projects. Is I find a sense of purpose and joy, and I can live my life in joy instead of fear, because fear is very prevalent out there, and it's a much better place to live in joy than fear. So I think faith-based programs are very, very helpful, and again, they bind people together with a common faith and belief system.
Yeah, certainly. I do feel that people rely heavily on their faith and spirituality during times of need, which often grief is, right? And so I love that you do that and that you've put those books out for those who relate to that and can find that community for themselves. Now, I'm going to move into our final segment here with personal reflections and advice that you may have for individuals. What do you wish more people understood about the end-of-life journey, both for themselves and for loved ones?
I think that I would like people to understand that it is like a graduation. I consider my death to be my graduation. And we strive to make a difference in the lives of the people around us. And when you strive to make a difference in the lives of people around us, it adds to your joy. That's the amazing thing. When I'm working with these widows in the grief groups, there's endorphins. Like when you go and help someone else get through tough times, you get endorphins back in your life too. So making your life worthwhile by helping people around you overcome all the things. Because when you get older, you learn a lot. I mean, all of us old people, we have a lot of learning. We've done a lot of learning in life, and we can pass that information on. So I think that's probably one of the biggest things is your life. You are not alone. You're still here. You still have purpose. Make that last part of your life meaningful and work hard. And if you're struggling with grief, fight it with everything you've got.
Yeah. I'm hopeful that with this episode, you'll convince a lot of people to start thinking about their legacy. And so if someone is beginning to think about their legacy, what's one piece of advice you'd give them to start the process today?
Right now, the easiest legacy that everybody can pass along is their love. So right now, get your emotional baggage in order, forgive now, apologize before it's too late, and reconcile with the people you need to reconcile with. Get that emotional baggage in order and tell everybody that you love them. And make sure they know it. Don't just assume they know it. Make sure they know it and show them that you love them. Those are probably the most important things you can do.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Looking ahead, how do you hope that your work and your books will help shape the way people approach end-of-life planning?
I hope, for one thing, that they're less afraid, that they're not afraid of death, that they know it's a natural thing. And I hope that they'll start preparing for it. And most of all, I hope that they'll see the importance of this preparation for death. They see how important that is to their families. And they'll show their love. It's a gift of love to your family to prepare for your death, to pass on your legacies, and then to die well.
Yeah. Where can listeners learn more about your books, your workshops, your resources for emotional insurance planning, end-of-life care planning, all of the fun stuff that you do?
Well, the book, Are You Ready? How to Build a Legacy to Die For, is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. So the book has everything you need to know before you go. It's a very comprehensive book. You can go to my website, drkimberlyharms.com, or you can check out our podcast, rethinkingdeath.life.
Wonderful. Before we close out, what is one takeaway you'd like the audience to consider as it relates to legacy building?
Get ready. The clock is ticking. Do it now.
I love that. Short and sweet.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Harms, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, for coming on the show and talking to us about the things people don't want to talk about, death and dying, and legacy building.
Thank you so much.